Hello, everyone, and greetings from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Welcome to our university's Secretary of the Navy guest lecture series, the virtual edition. I am Dr. Mara Oriskanen, Assistant Professor of Oceanography here at NPS, and I am honored to be with you today as a co-moderator for our discussion with Dr. Kathryn Sullivan, who is renowned for her pioneering spirit in space as an astronaut and as an oceanographer researching our planet's oceans. These lectures are featured a featured part of the NPS student learning experience at NPS, exposing our students and faculty to prominent speakers recognized as distinguished leaders in their fields of expertise. Since our guest today is distinguished in two fields of study, my NPS colleague, Dr. Giovanni Manelli from the Space Systems Academic Group will co-moderate. Giovanni, over to you to say more about the lecture today.
Thank you, Mara. While NPS has a strong oceanography department, we also have a strong space systems department, where I serve as faculty research associate. NPS, in fact, provides more astronauts to NASA than any other graduate university. These lectures are normally held in the auditorium of King Hall. However, we have adapted to the COVID-19 environment, working and studying remotely. Today is the fourth such virtual special guest lecture. This format provides our guests time for opening comments, followed by questions and answers from our student-led Q&A team and our viewers. Our Q&A team is comprised of 8 NPS students, 4 studying oceanography, and 4 in space systems. Both the oceanography and space systems departments are in the NPS Graduate School of Engineering and Applied Science. It's now my privilege to hand over to our host, the president of the Naval Postgraduate School, Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau, who will introduce our special guest speaker today. President Rondeau, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Manelli and Dr. Oriskanen, and welcome to everybody from the Naval Postgraduate School here in Monterey, California, for this great learning opportunity with Dr. Kathryn Sullivan, who was the first American woman to spacewalk and then to dive the deepest ocean. Dr. Sullivan's leadership journey is a brilliant testimony to the American spirit of science and innovation. She was a naval officer when I first met her many years ago, an astronaut, an aquanaut, and as a strong leader, she remains an inspiration and tribute to what is possible in the pursuit of knowledge that our great country enables and that the human spirit captures. This event today is also especially meaningful as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of American women's constitutional right to vote. So let me share a few highlights from Dr. Sullivan's remarkable career, and one in which she is still active and making strides. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Earth Sciences from the University of California at Santa Cruz and a PhD in geology from Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. She was one of the first 6 women to join the NASA Astronaut Corps in 1978 and holds the distinction of being the first American woman to walk in space. She also was involved in the Hubble project for NASA. Since leaving NASA, she held presidential appointments on the National Science Board and as chief scientist and administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, otherwise known as NOAA. Recently, her submersible dive to the Challenger Deep in June of 2020 made her the first person to both orbit the planet and reach its deepest point. Dr. Sullivan is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has been elected into the Astronaut Hall of Fame, Women Aviators Hall of Fame, Women Divers Hall of Fame, and the Ohio Veterans Hall of Fame. She's a Time Magazine 100 Most Influential People awardee and is the author of the children's book To the Stars and Handprints on Hubble, an Astronaut Story of Invention. The title of her talk today is From Sea to Space and Back Again, Lessons from an Unconventional Leadership Journey. Students, faculty, and staff, Ladies and gentlemen, all who are listening and watching, it is my pleasure to introduce our friend, but our leader of the moment and of a great legacy, Dr. Kathryn Sullivan. Kathryn, over to you.
Admiral Rondeau, it's a pleasure to see you and be with you again, even if only virtually. And let me thank you right at the outset for the invitation to take part in this great fun day. As the title of my remarks suggests, I want to share a few stories about some of my adventures by way of following the adage of show, don't tell, and then wrap near the end with a couple of the nuggets that I've taken away from my various stops along the road and that I continue to hold close to me and find value in and insight in every single day. Pictures are always worth thousands of words. So let me share some photos with you now. Kevin, if we can bring up the slides, please. So you see the two vehicles that I've had the grandest adventures in on this title slide. On the right is obviously the one I'm most well known for. That's Space Shuttle. I think that's Discovery, shown silhouetted against the Earth's limb. This was taken by astronauts aboard the International Space Station as Discovery was on approach for rendezvous and docking. Sadly, I was in the shuttle program too early to get such a nice far away view of my own spacecraft. But I want to point out one thing to you in this image. Take a look at the length of the shuttle silhouette with its nose on that bright orange line. That bright orange line is essentially the top of the troposphere, or the lowest layer of Earth's atmosphere, the layer that we live in. Now notice that if you take the silhouette of the shuttle and if you moved it to be just below that tropopause, that's all the thicker the atmosphere is. You know, poets over the years have referred to the atmosphere as an ocean of air. But I can tell you, and this image suggests it, when you get a few hundred miles away from our Earth and look at everything in its full context, our atmosphere is more like a thin membrane of water surrounding the planet, or almost like the thickness of the wall of a bubble. It looks fabulously elegant and fragile from this vantage point. On the left is the craft that I just went adventuring in this past June, as Admiral Rondeau mentioned. This is called the Limiting Factor submersible. And this is the adventure I'd like to tell you a little bit more about today. It's newer, it's a novel capability. It represents a radical change in mankind's ability to access the deepest parts of our ocean. I think it's not much of a stretch to say that the limiting factor in the exploration system that it supports, it is to oceanography of the past like a moonshot was to spacefaring in the 60s. And in fact, the frequency with which limiting factor can reach the bottom of the deep sea, any part of the deep sea, is rather like having the ability to do a moonshot a week. It's really quite a radical experience. Well, I went into the astronaut program straight out of graduate school. Spent 15 years there. And just so you have a sense of the stops along the road in between, after 15 years at NASA, I had my first presidential appointment to NOAA as the chief scientist. I then moved in 1996 to Columbus, Ohio to take over a nonprofit, one of the country's leading hands-on science education museums. It was in the process of a major rebuild, building a dramatically larger physical facility and needing also, therefore, to completely revamp the educational programs, the exhibitry, and all of our modes of operating internally to work at that larger scale with a larger audience. I shifted after a decade there to the Ohio State University to stand up a Science Technology Policy Institute, known as the Battelle Center for Science and Engineering Policy. And then in 2011 was recruited back to DC again to serve first as deputy administrator and then administrator of NOAA. So in all of those cases, it's been a fascinating ride through various cultures, various normal styles of doing things, but also through moments of great necessary transformation. And I learned basically through on-the-job training how to navigate those waters. So let's go on to this undersea adventure with the next slide. For those of you who are not oceanographers, On the left-hand side, that's an image of what the ocean would look like if you drained out the upper 6 kilometers worth of water. So remove about 18,000 feet of water, and look at the Earth straight down on the Antarctic continent, which you see in the center of the brown area. So the brown area is basically now the dry, muddy seafloor once you've pulled the water out. And the blue areas that are left are what's called the Hadal zone, Hadal, named after Hades, the deep underworld, because this is the deep underworld of our oceans. And you might notice, number one, they're not very large in aerial extent. That belies how much of the ocean's volume they represent, because they represent about 40% of the volume of the ocean. And you may notice most of them are long, linear, curved features. These are the great ocean trenches that famously line the Pacific Ocean basin, the so-called Ring of Fire. And that Ring of Fire is, in fact, where the Marianas Trench lies. The inset on the right puts it into more conventional geographic perspective for you. See Japan and the Philippines to the north and to the west, that big bow arc of the Marianas Trench. And the Challenger Deep sits at sort of the lower left-hand limit of the Marianas Trench. Two oceanic plates are moving past each other at that point, and that has effectively torn a slightly deeper portion of the trench floor at that location. So this is what I want to share with you a little bit. First, a bit of history to remember. Let's go to the next slide, remind ourselves of a sense of the scale in terms of depth. So the bluish wedge on the left, of course, symbolizes the full depth of the Marianas Trench. Shows here as 10,994 meters. It's very difficult to measure depth precisely in the deep, deep, deep sea. So that number is probably plus or minus 50 meters. And one of the results of the expedition that I was on, that Victor Vescovo has mounted, is refining that precision down to something more like plus or minus 6 meters. But what I would highlight here is it is as deep below sea level as a commercial airliner flies above the land when you're flying cross-country or a transoceanic flight. Basically 7 miles, just a tad shy of that. And I can tell you, after having dived to that depth, when I looked out the jetliner window flying back into Ohio from Tokyo, that 35,000 foot altitude looked a whole lot different to me. I've got a couple thousand hours of flying small jets at that altitude, but it never felt quite so high as it did after going all the way to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. The Marianas Trench, when Victor Vescovo started the expedition that I'm going to tell you about in a moment, the Marianas Trench, the bottom had only been reached twice. Once in 1960 by the bathyscaphe Trieste, piloted by Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and Swiss scientist Jacques Picard. And again, 52 years later, by filmmaker James Cameron in a custom-designed submersible called Deep Sea Challenger. Neither of those craft ever dove again after that first foray to the Marianas Trench. In the case of the Trieste, she was partly damaged, but the deep, deep sea was moving beyond the Navy's interest at that point, so they dried up their funding. And in the case of Deep Sea Challenger, taking any craft to the deep pressures of the Hadal zone is a really challenging thing to do. And the craft had lost half of its thrusters, and was pretty impaired by the time it got to the bottom of the trench. So 52 years between the first dive and the second dive there, and hold on to that number, because I'll come back to it in a few slides from now. So let's set the scene for the expedition that I joined in the next slide. This is the limiting factor in the water, off tow. Probably just has surfaced in this slide, I would guess, because she's riding fairly high in the water. And the vessel in the background is the support ship that carries her around to all the deep trenches, called the Pressure Drop. All these vessels are owned by and were privately funded by Victor Vescovo, who you'll meet in a moment. And all the names were chosen from a science fiction series he's completely enamored with, the Ian Banks Culture series. The Caladan Oceanic, which is the name of the company he's built to host and operate all these vehicles. Those of you who are sci-fi fans will know that Caladan comes from Frank Herbert's Dune. So these are the two vessels, primary vessels involved for the human portion of the exploration. And in the next slide, they are all the vision of one man, this gentleman on the left. Victor Vescovo is a private equity investor, background in geopolitics and economics, raised in the Texas area. He did a long stint as a Navy Reserve intel officer, so he's got some good Navy blue in his blood as well. And he's an adventurer on top of all of everything else. He had already summited the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents when the idea for this new adventure came to him. And in addition, he had skied across the North and the South Pole. Those 9 events constitute the explorer's Grand Slam. And as he was concluding the Grand Slam, I guess with his ocean background in mind, he thought, well, why isn't there a symmetrical match to the 7 summits, the deepest points in the ocean? And the first 2 things he discovered were the initial big hurdles. One was, well, no one actually knows quite exactly where those deepest points are. Sort of know they're going to be in the trenches, but what part of a 1,500 kilometer long trench is actually deepest was basically not known for any of the trenches, with maybe the exception of the Challenger Deep. And secondly, there was no vehicle on the planet that could take humans to that depth, like really none that could take you below about 3,000 meters. So not even half the depth that you needed to get to. He went to Triton submarines and talked to them about this vision. He went out on the surplus ship market and picked up the Pressure Drop, which started her life as a stalwart class Navy Tago ship and later became the NOAA ship MacArthur II. I'm pretty sure I signed the paperwork that dispatched her from the NOAA fleet and put her out on the market for Victor to buy, by the way. And in addition to getting the idea for this submersible and the ship to carry her around, what Victor really appreciated and recognized was that mankind has so little ability to explore and understand these deepest regions of the ocean. So he set out not just to create a submarine that would let him do 5 golly gee whiz, I got to the bottom dives, but really something he calls a hadal exploration system. The surface ship, the submersible, and autonomous scientific landers that can either work in concert with the submersible or independently to conduct scientific research. And finally, to solve the mapping problem, he equipped the Pressure Drop at no small expense with a Kongsberg 124 state-of-the-art, highest resolution multi-beam echo sounder and engaged 2 leading hydrographers from the University of New Hampshire's hydrography program. This shows us on board in the dry lab of the Pressure Drop the day of our dive, just doing a final brief of what our plan was. And in the next slide, I think you'll see us actually from the safety day of the dive. This is a cutaway to show you the basic construction of the submersible. Obviously, the most important part of it from a human point of view is the spherical bit in the center. That's a 1.5 meter diameter titanium sphere with a wall thickness of 90 millimeters, so about 3.5 inches. That's what it takes to withstand the 16,000 pounds per square inch that it will be subjected to at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. You see to the left and right of the sphere near the bottom, battery boxes, electronic boxes. You see the structural support around the middle of the craft for the thruster complexes on the port and starboard side. Along the top are various antennas and CTD or salinity temperature depth instruments, a GPS antenna and radio VHF antenna for communications on the surface. And the central trunk that you climb down through to get into the sub, you're looking down through that trunk in the picture on the right, give you a sense of how cozy the inside is. And I really would say cozy, not as cramped as Alvin or a Pisces sub, which I've also done deep dives in. Some room to move around in. It's kind of like an economy airline seat for a long day. You're not getting up and walking around, but you can shift around a little bit. So what were we going to do on this expedition? In the next slide, the essence of the work centered on this question of getting the bathymetry right. In this view, every part of the Marianas Trench that is shallower than 10 kilometers has just been shaded to a brick red. So the yellows down to blues are showing you the regions below or greater than 10 kilometers depth. And you can see the Challenger Deep is segmented into several pools. They're separated by small sills. It's long been believed that the deepest point in the trench is in the eastern pool. And so Victor's plan was to dive to the eastern pool and not just drop in and look around, but run transects, just as you would in a normal surveying operation. Put the 3 scientific landers on the bottom ahead of time, rendezvous with each one of them along the submarine's traverse, build an intercomparison pool of instruments that should help reduce the margin of error or the uncertainty around the depth measurements. And there were 3 dives planned for the expedition segment that I was on. So remember I said 52 years from dive number 1 to dive number 2. We set out to do 3 dives to the deepest point in the ocean in the span of a week. And we did it. And after a quick turnaround and crew exchange at Guam, pressure drop came out again for another 10-day run. And it again did 3 max depth dives in a span of a week. So this was our plan into the eastern pool. And the next slide, show you at the bottom. Here's the transects we were going to do. The dashed lines were the sub paths. You see the black circles are the landing and surfacing points, and the triangles are where we were going to drop the landers. I was on the traverse, the upper of those 2 white traverses. So that was the game plan. You can see, by the way, there is topographic variability even in these deep pools. Just a little bit of Hollywood gossip backstory to this. James Cameron, when he dove in the Deep Sea Challenger, it's believed landed in that yellowish area to the left, to the western edge of the deep. He was on the bottom for about an hour and a half, and he reported it was flat as a billiard table. Oddly, he then said to Victor Vescovo, I got to 10,908 meters, so that's the number to beat, which sort of suggests he knew it wasn't completely flat. Vescovo is not doing this scientific work to really continue a snit with Jim Cameron. He's a quant. He's a data guy. You resolve this by getting more data. And by the way, scientific value of just knowing what the bottoms of these trenches are like and how they affect the geology and the biology actually matters. So off we go. We get in the sub. We get clearance to dive. It's a 4-hour elevator ride down to the bottom with the shape of limiting factor. And it's in contrast to leaving the planet to go into orbit, which is 8.5 of the most intense minutes you've ever had in your life. You're riding a bomb. You're embedded in a massive ball of energy. This really was a calm, serene, 4 pleasant hours to chat together, check in with the surface every 15 minutes, eat half your lunch at about 32,000 feet so that you're not busy on the bottom. It was really quite delightful. We were saving all our electrons for being on the bottom, so we did not run lights on the way down. We're going down at about 1 meter per second, so we're not really able to make any biological observations in the water column. But again, that was not the point of the excursion. So next slide, at the end of that 4-hour elevator ride, here we are on the bottom. This is the eastern pool of the Challenger Deep. We made about a 2-kilometer traverse. Our dive was cut short, unfortunately, by an internal battery issue that triggered the automatic release of our surfacing weights. So this is what it looked like as we came across. You might notice some signs of scouring, some streaking that shows where there's some bit of current scouring the bottom. It's a busy bottom, I would say, oceanographically. There's those little humps and nodules are probable signs that there's a fair bit of biology in the upper sediment layers. Bristleworms, polychaetes, amphipods, and the things you see sort of drifting along on the bottom as the sub goes by are holothurians, a deep ocean variety of sea cucumbers. It reminded me of a moonscape. It was a really smooth, easy traverse. And again, we were trying to fly a constant altitude above the bottom to help refine our downward-looking sonar measurements. So we did not land to take closer looks at any of these critters. So we did arrive in the next slide at one of our landers. And this is what it looked like out my viewport. SCAF was equipped with Niskin water sampling bottles, CTD and depth measurement instruments, and a sediment grabber, which you can just see in that yellow bit just below the name SCAF. was this sediment sampler. And it was right as we were finishing up our triangulation with SCAF and the surface finished triangulating on both of us. That was right when the internal battery failed and we ended up heading to the surface instead of heading on to the next lander. Victor was very apologetic that my 4-hour dive turned to an hour and a half on the bottom. But as I reminded him, there's some cardinal rules of great adventures like spaceflight. And the first and foremost rule is there is no such thing as a bad spaceflight. And I can promise you there's no such thing as a bad Marianas Trench dive either. So let's go to the next slide. As I said, I was on one of 3 dives in this segment, and there were 3 more in the next segment. And this gives you a sense of the sum total of the transects and the lander deployments that we did during our week at sea. Again, the triangles denote lander locations. You can see the very short transect that starts around the middle of the pool. That was dive number 1, just very short. That's the white dash line. Longer transect on the second dive, and a longer transect on the third dive. That's the one that comes in from the left, dips down, and then goes up to the north. And that's the only dive that got near the trench wall. So 3 dives and 9 lander deployments in 7 days is a tremendous scientific capacity in these deep regions compared to anything that has existed before. I want to share a couple of things with you from the other dives, because I care more about the expedition in toto than about my particular dive. The next slide, you'll see some of the topography around the trench wall from that third dive. Very steep. Anyone with the geological background would look at the shape of those rock outcrops and pretty quickly conclude that those are probably cooled lava flows of some sort. You've seen the faceting of columnar jointing, which you commonly see in cooling basalt flows. And you might notice on some of the boulders on the right, a yellow coloring. That's a chemosynthetic bacterial coating that's developed on these rocks. This is one of the things that's still so poorly known about the deep, deep sea. You don't expect to see black smokers in a deep ocean trench like you would at an oceanic spreading center. But there are cold seeps of water at various trench locales and back arc basin locales. And it has been discovered over the past years in some of these much shallower regions that those seeps also support bacterial life in the deep sea. What had not been recognized is that you've got these chemosynthetic encrustations happening right in the trench axis without any apparent cold water seep or chimneys around. And the next image I want to share is from one of our landers on the second dive. This is the same SCAF that you saw. And you see that little white critter swimming up from underneath the lander. SCAF landed close to on top of this poor guy. Probably woke him up from a nap, and he's making his way out of the frame, get out of the lander's way. We've paused it here because I want you to notice that this critter is essentially transparent. That yellow thing you're seeing is its innards, its stomach. We'll run it again so you can get another look at the mode of moving. It's a whole full body undulation, rather like a Spanish dancer nudibranch would show. The tendrils are most likely feeding tendrils rather than locomotion tendrils. So this is the only guy really actively moving around that we saw. One final thing to observe, you see that blue wheel-like shape in the center of the frame. And if you look below that, you might just notice a thin yellow line. Both here in the eastern pool and even more so in the western pool, Vescovo has seen vast amounts of fiber optic cable littering the bottom that were probably cut away from autonomous and semi-autonomous scientific vehicles in advance of their retrieval. If you've got a vehicle down at these depths, 11 kilometers down, relaying its data up through a fiber optic cable, you've probably got easily 15 kilometers of tether out there and probably more. And it'd be very difficult to retrieve that. I recognize it, but it should be noted that, scientific debris, in addition to other human debris, is now becoming an issue in some of the deep ocean environments. Some of the critters that have been sampled from the Marianas Trench, by the way, have shown elevated levels of microplastics in their guts, and physical pieces of debris ranging from a plastic bag to a soda can have been seen in the trench axis here in the Marianas Deep. Let's go to the next one now, Kevin, please. I just wanted to toss, this is a screenshot, so it's not a great photo actually, but wanted to give you a sense of the detail and definition that the multi-beam sonar work that Vescovo's team has collected is providing of these super deep trench environments. The pressure drop has mapped at Victor Vescovo's personal expense something right around 1 million square kilometers of ocean at this point, principally in these deep ocean trench environments. All of those data are being given over to the JEVCO Ocean 2030 bathymetric base. And in fact, the bathymetry that we are collecting on this expedition had been by request of NOAA, and he's just turning all the data over to NOAA as well. So it's a tremendous step forward on both scientific observations on the bottom, sediment samples, biological observations via video, water samples, beginning to get sort of the eDNA of the water column in these deep hadal regions has never been done before. It's really, really quite exciting. So let's shift gears now. I'm known for these grand adventures. We can go to the next slide, Kevin. And just as a transition point here, this is what really has motivated every move I've made in my career. It's to better understand this planet and to develop and deliver data and information that can help all of us who are trying to live on the planet do so more wisely, do so successfully, do so sustainably. And so this is just moving orange segments that give you a sense of the kind of power that satellite observations, when combined with in situ observations, the kind of capacity it gives us to understand our planet and how it works, from vegetation to soil moisture to biosphere. The green in this segment that's coming by shows you both on land and in the ocean where plants are blooming, soil moisture in this next one, precipitation, air, clear air and clouds. And my very favorite coming around here shortly, which is a combination of in situ data, modeling, and satellite data, is the intricacy of oceanic circulation. This is as evidenced by the temperatures of the surface waters. So understanding this planet has always been my quest. The reason I applied to become an astronaut in the first place was principally because I would get to see the Earth with my own eyes if I succeeded at being selected. It was secondarily that I'm an ops geek. I'm all about planning and executing expeditions. That's really my sweet spot. And the chance to dive with Victor Vescovo to the Challenger Deep was very much the same thing. To personally see that environment, for me, crystallizes and synthesizes vast amounts of information that I've processed intellectually. But there's something about that extra dimension of comprehension that comes from the personal experience. And if you doubt that, I want you to consider the following proposition. There's no need for you to go to your son or daughter's wedding. We'll send a photographer and they'll deliver the album. It's just the same. We all know it's not just the same. Well, let's shift gears, move towards the close here because I'm talking more than I wanted to, and I want to get to our questions. So Kevin, next slide, please. Get quickly through a couple of nuggets here. My path to learning how to lead was an odd one. At 26 years old, I popped out of graduate school and was bestowed a blue NASA astronaut flight suit. The thing about being an astronaut is you have no real authority over anybody. You don't own anybody's paycheck. You don't own anybody's evaluation or fitness report. You're only in charge of your learning experience. And yet you are in this iconic sort of central visible role. And obviously the big consequences like getting back alive, but also the consequence of mission success revolves very much around you. So this was like in the deep end of learning the difference between leading and managing, learning how to bring people along by force of argument, by abundance of data, by mastery of your subject matter, but also by understanding what their leverage points were, what their motivational points were, and how to engage them. Because again, you could scream or yell or throw a tantrum, but no one actually reported to you. No one actually had to obey anything that you said. The next one, please. One-trick ponies. To me, along the same lines, a lot of the folks I worked with in the astronaut corps were very much what I call one-trick ponies. In their world and the way they'd grown up, the one right and only best way to spur people to excellence was combative and challenging and competition. That's what gets people to do their best. I was walking out across the pool deck to get suited up for an underwater training run one time with an Army colleague who was junior to me. So I was taking him on this test run. It was a really good deal for him. And I was about to turn to him and give him my rah-rah, come on, big important test, really got to do this right, critical for Hubble. Glad you're with me, know we can do this. And he sort of figuratively threw an elbow at me. He did the verbal equivalent of, I'll do better than you, I'll beat you to the corner. Since I was senior, I stopped him and said, what the heck was that? And to my surprise, he proceeded to give me the same speech I was about to give. That was his way of trying to engage me to do our best. It's not the reaction, it's not the consequence it had to me, but he had a hammer and every problem therefore looked like a nail, and he used the hammer all the time. Competition and challenge is one path to excellence. It is not the only path to excellence. And it is not the tool that will work with every person of every gender or race or culture, national culture that you meet. Next one, please. Winston Churchill. I'll recommend a book to you in a moment to think about Winston Churchill. I think it's the best one by far I've ever read, not least because it's the shortest. But Winston Churchill in 1940 faced the decision of whether Britain would fight the Nazi onslaught or capitulate. What you have to realize is Winston Churchill had precious little influential standing at the moment that that decision landed in his lap. And I think you will find when you read the book I'm going to recommend, what did he draw on? How do you make such a momentous decision when your credibility is in doubt, even in your own mind, and you have to bring so many people along with you? And I think what Churchill turned to in that moment was an identity proposition. There are some things the British people never will be, no matter the cost. And I have found when I hold tight to that notion in every organization I've been in as a leader, to be clear about our identity proposition. Who are we? Who will we never be? How do we come together to do the work? And what will we not tolerate? This is not my watch, not my unit, not my Navy, not here. It's a powerful way to think about culture, and it's a powerful way to remind everyone of their responsibility to show up all the way and not be a bystander when something's not the way it ought to be for who we are. So here's one, the next one, please, Kevin. I bet you never thought you'd see Chris Rock's name right side by side with Winston Churchill, but here you go. Chris Rock and countless other comedians are fabulous examples of continual learning. Pixar is another great example. Learning and mistakes are instruments of learning. They're not indicators of deficiency. You have to be continually trying and experimenting and learning. And one way to get yourself into that mindset is to break out of the question of, do we know this will work? And shift into what's called the affordable loss principle. How bad can this be? Let's try it. Let's build 1,000 of these and see if they work, rather than trying to perfect all of the knowledge and all of the predictions in advance. It's impossible for an organization to truly be a learning organization if the leader is not seen and showing himself to actively be learning as well as everybody else. You create force multipliers as you develop a continuous learning organization. Next one, please. I think this is the simple formula for the most effective way to steer and hold accountable any organization. For the leader to be really clear about what the ends are that we're pursuing, what are the purposes we need to achieve, and clear about the set of means that we plan on using to get there. But then, as you delegate this over to the leaders around you, don't try to stipulate and specify everything they're allowed to do. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible in any real world situation, in any kind of ambiguity or uncertainty. Tell them the few things they're not allowed to do in pursuit of these ends. If it was a football field, it might be get our ball through that goalpost, pass and run and block, stay between the hash marks if that was important to you for some reason. And maybe you would say don't throw any more than 30% of the passes. But then you need to let that leader get out there and adjust and adapt to the situations that they're seeing on the line. Sometimes perhaps even deviate from what you said, but have a good reason for doing that. This is really how you get force multipliers around you and prevent an organization becoming single-threaded just around you. And finally, someone we should all keep in mind, Mrs. Frizzle, our favorite person from the Magic School Bus. I'll leave you with her motto, which again is something I hold close to my heart all the time. Take chances, make mistakes, get messy. Kevin, final slide, please. So these are the several books that I recommend to you. 5 Days in London on the bottom is where I got that insight about the identity propositions and how I think Churchill turned fundamentally to that when he made his decision to fight in 1940. There was no apparent evidence anywhere around him that that was the sensible decision to make, but he did. Little Bets, you'll read about Chris Rock, Pixar, other outfits that have really developed that continuous learning culture and had that mindset of, we can try this. And then Orbiting the Giant Hairball, you all work in large organizations. I've worked in a lot of organizations. There's a virtue to having scale and capacity. The scale and capacity a large organization gives you. But as a leader of an innovative or inventive or creative unit, a unit with some initiative, you've got to find ways to take advantage of the giant hairball that you're orbiting around, but protect those attributes in the team that you're leading. You'll love the doodles in the margin. This is the guy that ran the creative cards division for Hallmark cards for many years. And if you think the Deep Blue Navy can be onerous, Mother Hallmark has probably matched the Navy step for step. So we can break back from the slides now. Kevin, please. And I just want to thank you all for listening to my stories for a little bit. I hope you got some nuggets out of them as well. But most of all, I hope I triggered a number of questions for you to ask in our discussion ahead. So let's drop into the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. We've had some fantastic SGL speakers, but I want to say to you what I've never said to any of them. That was really cool. And so I really want to thank you for a great time. Now it is time to turn it over to our terrific student Q&A team. So Dr. Manelli, over to you for that portion now of this great engagement.
Well, thank you, President Rondeau. Mara and I will alternate back and forth, introducing our student Q&A team members one at a time, and they will offer Dr. Sullivan a question. Viewers are also encouraged to submit questions, which you could do via the link on our viewing webpage. So to get started, we'll start with the space segment first. We have Major Jordan Blake, who's in the Space Systems Operations Program. He's a naval flight officer in the EA-6B as an electronic countermeasures officer. His last tour before NPS was as an instructor in the EA-6B aircraft and division head at Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1. After graduation, he expects to go back to the same squadron as the Space Systems officer. Major Blake, what is your question?
Good afternoon, Matt. First, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And then my question is, a lot of NPS students have young kids who get to see aspects of both military and academic life. as they try to figure out what they want to do in their future career? What guidance would you have to help them tackle the question of what do you want to be when you grow up?
You know, Major, I never could answer that question when people used to ask me that. I could tell you from about age 8 what I wanted my life to be like. I wanted it to be adventurous and inquisitive, like I was seeing in Jacques Cousteau and the early astronauts. But I had no idea what that meant you do or be. And I just sort of navigated my way towards that answer throughout my school years I think I realized that studies and academics would be a helpful boost to that. It'd be the toolkit that would let me have options and choices. And it really was an exploratory proposition. This is what I passionately want to have in my life. Keep studying, keep working, and keep watching the horizon. So my first theory of how to achieve that was actually to study foreign languages, because a family friend helped me realize I have a flair for them. That theory persisted until I got to college. And then my college forced me to take 3 science courses. I threw every argument I had at them against doing that and failed, thank heavens, because that's when I discovered earth science and oceanography. And I saw in the lives of these dynamic young professors just that sort of energy, just that sort of inquisitiveness, and changed majors and went after them. So I'm a real fan of know what the deep pieces are. You may find those deep pieces that really matter to you in multiple places or multiple forms. So don't get stuck on a label too soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Thank you, Major Blake. Mara, take us diving, please.
Unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, and thank you, Giovanni, for handing that over to me. Apologies, we had a fire alarm earlier, so of course, if the bells go off, it's apologies for that. In the meantime, I wanted to thank you for that wonderful talk, introducing that new adventure. This is just a great story to hear, but I also really resonated with your comment on the one-trick pony and how everybody learns differently, and we can't all be nails for hammers. So thank you for that in particular. And with that, I'd like to introduce the first from my Naval Oceanography team, who is Lieutenant Commander Kellen Jones. He is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Meteorology, and he is conducting research on advanced climate analysis and forecasting using machine learning. He's a Naval Meteorology and Oceanography officer and a qualified surface warfare officer. Lieutenant Commander Jones's previous tour was as the flag aide to Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet. After graduation, he is headed back to sea duty next June. Lieutenant Commander Jones, what is your question?
Thanks, Professor. Dr. Sullivan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Before I ask my question, I'd like to mention I once did a swim call over Challenger Deep, and I'd like to think I'm comfortable in the water as a scuba diver, but 36,000 feet of water beneath me was a bit too terrifying.
Yeah, we did a swim call. Nobody saw bottom on our swim call either.
So my question, ma'am, is given depressing rates of U.S. and global scientific literacy, the current political climate, and a hypothesis that our species just simply hasn't evolved to efficiently analyze risks and rewards in long-term decisions, how optimistic are you that we as Americans and citizens of the world will decisively act in time to confront the challenges of climate change?
Boy, that's a thorny question. I'm kind of a congenital optimist, but I have to say I worry about those factors that you listed out, an anti-scientific bias, a loss of shared confidence in data and facts, the hyper-politicization. I've had a scientific presidential appointment under every president since Ronald Reagan, which adds up to more Republicans than Democrats. And there used to be a cadre of scientists that were trusted by both parties and all branches of government to just bring the best scientific or technical information that was available to add to the decision making. And I really fear we're losing that. It's now, you're registered in this party, therefore only one party would care to have your advice on issues. I think that's going to be very harmful to us as an advanced society in the long run. We, the human beings on this planet, are being forced even now to adapt to the ecological and other natural changes that are happening. The planet will be fine, by the way. The planet may go the way of Venus or Mars and lose the ability to support life, or it may just go in a direction that means it can only support a very different array of life than we know now. So I'm not worried about the planet. I do think the evidence is the data are very clear about the physics and what's happening, and evidence I think is clear and growing that the scale of adaptations we're going to have to try to tackle is rising, and probably will accelerate and rise at an accelerating rate.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Jones. And now Giovanni, back to take us up to space again.
Thank you, Mara. Next up, we have Lieutenant Logan West. He is currently in the astronautical engineering program at NPS. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 2012 with a bachelor's degree in systems engineering. His research at NPS is to design, build, and test a low-cost, high-bandwidth X-band software-defined radio for CubeSats. He's a naval special warfare officer. His last tour, he served as squad commander with SEAL Team 2, and after graduation, he expects to be assigned to SEAL Team 8 to serve as platoon commander. Lieutenant West, what is your question?
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for the introduction. Good afternoon, ma'am. And again, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. It's really an honor to have you here. My question for you today is this. The highlights of your career have required working closely with teams or crews in confined spaces and high-stress environments for extended periods. In your opinion, what was the most critical aspect of team cohesiveness that allowed you to work together to accomplish the mission successfully?
Thanks very much, Logan. The essential thing is to get a team working together so that it really builds deep trust that you're pursuing a shared purpose. No one's playing for their personal press release. No one's playing for just to get the bigger promotion or the better next assignment. You're really all in on the same thing. And you know what? That's one of the dimensions of the Vescovo expedition that I learned a lot about being out at sea. He had folks that came along from the oil and gas industry offshore field running the ship. He had a contract guy running the galley. He had the Triton team running the submersible. He had a scientific cadre doing the science. And they all at the outset came from different backgrounds, different ways of looking at the world and looking at things, different incentive structures, different, each company or each academic institution was grading them on various things. They didn't really know how to talk to each other. And there was a lot of, you sort of had to break all those seams down in order to get them to really understand they were working together on this one common thing. When the stakes are really high, it's actually a little easier to do that. Before every shuttle launch, everyone who's got any systems responsibility has to sign their name on something called the Flight Readiness Certificate. That's where you attest that everything under your responsibility has been done properly and well, and the crew will come home alive. So if you've had somebody playing political games or just joshing a colleague, arguing whether 2 + 2 is 4 or 5, you could push that piece of paper to them and say, great, you signed the FRR if you're so convinced of your position. And that would strip away some of the gamesmanship that sometimes could creep in. It's a harder thing to achieve and sustain when there's not those really severe forcing functions that sort of haul everybody up short. So in the day-to-day, when maybe some pennies of earnings per share is at risk, not human lives, I think one of the art forms of leadership is how can you extract some of the DNA of that getting to shared purpose and instill it in the people around you, and that they trust that everyone there is playing for that purpose, not their own bonus, not their own press release.
Excellent, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mara, over to you.
So diving back down to the ocean, we have Lieutenant Commander West, who is consequently not related to Lieutenant West that we just heard from. And he is studying meteorology and operational oceanography at NPS. His current research involves high-energy laser adaptive optics, corrections for optical turbulence in the maritime environment. Austin is a meteorology and oceanography officer within the information warfare community. His previous tour, he served as hydrographer-in-chief at the Fleet Survey Team, and after graduation will serve as the METOC Division Officer aboard the USS George Washington next summer. Lieutenant Commander West, what is your question?
Good afternoon. It's an honor to speak with you. During your talk, you mentioned that the photographs, although perhaps awe-inspiring, don't convey the same level of information as personal observation. Having observed the Earth from two vastly unique perspectives, my curiosity to you is, both as an explorer and a pioneer, which do you see more value for humankind in, deep sea or space exploration?
Well, the space perspective on this planet is of incredible value to humankind. It is only since the space age. Satellites give us the capability to essentially snapshot conditions on the entire Earth in what's effectively a simultaneous image. And it's that synoptic capability that satellites have provided, plus supercomputers and the accumulated knowledge of many decades of research. But it is that capacity to sense the entire planet essentially simultaneously that transformed weather forecasting, that really helped enable El Nino forecasting. Although, again, I want to emphasize satellites are not magic. They don't just deliver El Nino forecasts. There's huge arrays of buoys moored across the ocean basins that provide the in situ data that's critical to that as well. But so that aspect of space exploration is absolutely vital and essential to humanity's future. I am not a fan of we must go to Mars or we must learn to live on the moon because we're screwing up this planet. That strikes me as a fundamentally amoral proposition. And I think would only lead to, the ultimate version of a gated community, because that's not a proposition that's going to take 7 billion people off the planet. That's a proposition that would take some, however they were chosen, lucky or daring few to go try to start again. So the space perspective is clearly important, but the ocean is our life support system. And I see your dolphins on the wall there, Lieutenant Commander. I doubt that you would get into any sub where you not completely intimately understand the life support system that was going to allow you to patrol safely for months at a time. Well, we don't completely understand the life support system on this planet. And it starts with, most fundamentally, the ocean.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Lieutenant Commander West, and back to you, Giovanni.
Thank you, Mara. Next up, we have Captain Heidi Beamer, who's studying space system operations at NPS. Her thesis is working with NASA Armstrong and the NPS Railgun Lab to develop a lunar surface innovation initiative, which is going to investigate the use of a lunar railgun to send ice to the lunar gateway to fuel deep space travel. She's a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense officer for the Army. Before attending NPS, she was the commander for the 181st Hazard Response Company of Fort Hood, Texas, and upon graduation in March, will be instructing physics at West Point. Captain Beamer, what is your question?
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being here. Ma'am, it's been awesome to hear your story. So my question today, as a geologist and oceanographer during the shuttle era, your peer group with a similar background was small. How do you see the astronaut corps evolving to embrace physical sciences as future programs move their sights towards future exploration of the moon and Mars?
Thank you, Captain. You can see some of that in the trend lines of selection criteria of the several more recent classes. There's always going to be a strong demand and need for engineering talent as well. As we all know, you're living in the system that you're operating and exploring in. So the combination of engineering and scientific talent will be important. I think as missions are mounted, and the Artemis Lunar Gateway and Artemis program, as you know well, is a good example. You've got to get down to the planetary geology and planetary physics as well to figure out if it's really viable to take water ice from the moon. I mean, what's the percentage of that? What are the geotechnical properties of the regolith area that you're working on? How do you actually extract and process that? So I think you will always see the science and engineering closely fused or tightly interwoven in space exploration. And longer duration flights or off-planet stays will bring a lot of the medical sciences back to the fore again as well. But the slant is clearly there towards more of the scientific fields. I think one of the challenges with NASA is NASA looks at the talent base in toto that it needs for Artemis, for example, and how much of which talents need to be in the astronaut cadre is a subordinate question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Captain Bieber. Mara.
Back over to the ocean, and now we have Lieutenant Teresa Schultz, who is also in the Meteorology and Oceanography program at NPS. She is also a Navy NETOC officer and just started her very first quarter at NPS. She's got 9 more to go after this one. And so she still has to consider her research challenge, which requirement for NPS students to graduate. Her last tour was as an anti-submarine warfare instructor at the Center for Surface Combat System Detachment East, Norfolk, Virginia. After graduation, she will be assigned either as a staff NETOC or a division officer on an aircraft carrier or amphibious ship. Lieutenant Schultz, what is your question?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for this amazing experience. Being able to see how your career has progressed is just amazing. My question has to do with leadership. Have you experienced any leadership challenges being a leader in a predominantly male-dominated field? And what recommendations could you give to other leaders from what you have learned from your experiences?
Great question, Lieutenant. Thank you. I've always kept a mental list in my head that has 2 columns on it. And one is, as I observe people around me, what I hope to emulate. Somebody's leadership capability or practice that goes on the left-hand side of the list. When I ever lead something, I want to be like that. I want to remember how to do that. And the other column has been, I promise I will never do it that way. And I got to tell you, I put a whole lot more entries on that right-hand side of my list when I was in the astronaut corps than I did any on the left. There were some very, very great leaders there, to be sure. I had the great privilege of flying with one of them twice, Major General Charlie Bolden. But there were also a couple of toxic people, and as I alluded to, several that just, I know how you do this, I punch you in the nose, I tell you you can't get it done, and that'll make you mad, and that'll work. So I think being one of few in a group that otherwise is large and different than you, whether that's by gender or by race, it becomes a fact that the burden is on you, the few, to figure out how to navigate the everybody else, because their patterns are well set. They've worked for them. They're all successful. They're understandably proud of them and confident in them, and their mindset tends to be, I know this works, and so you have to show me you can do what I had to do, or I won't be sure that you're as good as me. That's a really hard syndrome to break out of, and to get to where excellence by other means can stand the test of time. We encountered bits of that as we went into the astronaut corps, but we also walked in with the fanciest title in the agency. I mean, if you walked into the Navy with 4 stars on your shoulder, I think you'd get a little different treatment than if you walk in with a butter bar on your shoulder and you're the lone female or the lone African American. You're going to get all the standard hazing that the butter bar entitles you to, and an extra dose because I've not seen anyone who looked like you succeed at this yet. The other dimension I think you see in the military culture and in the medical field is where this field has hard moments in it, right? There are real brass tack moments serving the military or being in medicine where lives are on the line on your hands. And that develops an ethos of, I'm going to chew on you and wire brush you as we work together, because if you can't stay focused and succeed at your job when it's just me chewing on you, it's just me trash talking you or trying to put you off your game, then how will I know you can hang in there and perform the mission when it gets really ugly? Again, I think that's it's not the only way to steel each other and harden each other and develop the strength that you're going to need as a team, but it does tend to be the preferred way. I go with the Charlie Bolden list.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Lieutenant Schultz. Back to you, Giovanni.
Thanks, Mara. And the fourth of our students is Captain David Ritchie. He's in the U.S. Marine Corps and in the Space Systems Engineering program at NPS. His thesis focuses on the optimization of proximity maneuvers to develop a new way to find the lowest fuel or time maneuver for a spacecraft to rendezvous or evade within 50 kilometers of each other. He's a naval flight officer in the EA-6B Prowler aircraft. His last tour was in a Prowler squadron deployed to CENTCOM. Upon graduation, he expects to go to the United States Naval Academy to teach in the aerospace department. Captain Ritchie, what is your question?
Thank you, Dr. Manelli, and ma'am, thank you for being here with us today. It's fascinating that Victor Vescovo, a private investor, helped so much with the exploration of the Mariana Trench, and I can't help but relate him to the big names in private space exploration like Musk, Bezos, Branson. So it seems to us that the private sector is a little more less risk averse than government, but government has more resources and national interests that they could intertwine in these adventures that we've been on. So having been involved in both government and private run explorations, which do you prefer and why?
Yeah, I think it's a false choice to cast it that way. They are different animals. They have different operating tempos, different MOs, and they can serve different things. The upside of government investment is that it can be more patient capital than you often find coming from the private sector. The upside of the private sector is speed of decision and autonomy and flexibility. That's hard when you've got all the layers of accountability and insurance that get stacked up to try to ensure proper stewardship of taxpayer dollars. I often think of this as a dichotomy or duality of hunting versus farming. And in the world of scientific and technological advance, I think the wise investment policy needs to include both some farming and some hunting. Farming in the sense of tilling soil, putting down water, putting out seeds, exploring things that you don't know yet will pay big dividends. I'm not talking about randomly oriented curiosity excursions. There can be a purposeful intent to it, but we never really quite know where the frontier of our knowledge is or what some next insight might enable when it connects with other developments. You just don't. So how do you support some patient capital that can farm without assurance of an immediate return, without the assurance that whoever funded it can capture all the intellectual benefits? All of those advances, by the way, go into a knowledge base that is a fabulous open innovation platform. The private sector, on the other hand, rightly takes a usually pretty incremental, how do I improve something? How do I make something new? And then go after it with a sort of lean and mean agility that large agencies just can't muster. But another adage I really love, attributed to Henry Ford, and maybe apocryphal, but still, the caution to watch out for the incremental. If Henry Ford had been applying to today's National Science Foundation to work on what became the Model T, he probably would have had to convince them that he could build a faster horse. We want transportation to improve. Horses are not fast enough. Can you deliver me a faster horse? What that could not deliver would be a really transformative concept for how to think about mobility. So you want them both. But by the same token, he drew on industrial base, as same happened in the World War II science effort. You drew on advances in fundamental sciences that were the building blocks of what you were going to do next. Well, how did those get developed, if not with patient capital to explore the true unknowns?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Captain Ritchie. Mara, take us diving, please.
All right, and back down to the ocean, we have Lieutenant Stephanis Dunn, who graduated from Prairie View A&M and is a surface warfare officer. Her previous tours include 2 years on a cruiser, CG-54 USS Antietam out of Japan, and 2 years on the USS Arlington in Virginia. Here at NPS, she is an undersea warfare in the Undersea Warfare program with graduation set for next month. Her thesis research topic is studying the dynamics of beach breaching and its impacts to naval operational planning. After NPS, she will go to department head school to prepare for her next ship in August 2021. Lieutenant Dunn, what is your question?
Thank you, ma'am, for having us, and thank you for joining us. My question is, how can we continue to increase awareness, support, and funding for research and exploration of our planet? People are easily excited and supportive of space exploration, but we haven't invested nearly as much in deep ocean exploration.
Boy, I think I'd get a new category of Nobel Prize if I had a really good answer to that, Lieutenant. You know, and it's always been an oddity to me because when I was very young, like around age 10, the quest and the urge, the passion for exploring both dimensions seemed on a pretty even footing. There were weekly magazines back then, one called Life and one called Look, and virtually every issue that hit our doorstep had a story about the early astronauts and about Jacques Cousteau or deep sea habitats or the Conch Shelf Project. And then it diverged. And I think in the United States anyway, the rationale there is, and the driving force was the way in which spaceflight came to be seen as an important domain for some soft power diplomacy, and a way to demonstrate and showcase publicly to the world the technological prowess of the United States, and as importantly and very consciously to convey to the world that was changing very, very rapidly that you wanted to align with the United States and what it stood for freedom, for inquiry, for openness. Reading a great book that's going to come out shortly called Moonglow that explores a lot of these dynamics in great detail and points out, for example, in the year 1960, so this is just before, Sputnik has flown, Gagarin's about to fly, very early space era. In the year 1960 alone, 17 new countries were added to the map as the former colonial regimes began to unwind. And this alliance competition between the Soviet Union and the United States was a big driver in that. There was no NASA equivalent in the deep sea world to make any kind of similar claim. And so that the Navy's viewpoint on what's needed and important in terms of mastering the seas prevailed. And that basically is maybe down to 1,000 feet. That's all we need. So I lament the fact, the agency I got to lead during President Obama's second term, NOAA, was dreamt of as being the NASA of the ocean, but for various reasons never got the same clear charter and public support. The final thing is, some people live with the ocean nearby and sand between their toes, but everybody looks up at the stars and the moon. So it's a much broader shared experience.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Lieutenant Dunn. Back to you, Giovanni.
Well, thank you, Mara. And that takes us through our 8 students. So now we will be recycling, starting at the top again. And our students will be asking questions that they've both prepared themselves and also questions that our viewers have submitted through the chat window. So we will go back to Major Jordan Blake. If you could please ask Dr. Sullivan a question.
Thank you, Dr. Manali. Ma'am, good afternoon again. In the spirit of Miss Frizzle, my next question comes from Mrs. Jennifer Blake's first grade class from Crumpton Elementary School. They read your book, To the Stars, and then kind of want to know, what does it feel like to walk in space? And then as my own little follow-up, what can we do as parents, educators, mentors to stimulate STEM education in America's youth?
Well, it doesn't feel like walking at all if you're working around the space shuttle or the space station because you're in a microgravity environment. So it feels, it's more like swimming. You're moving hand over hand. You can move your body and massive objects with the tips of 1 or 2 fingers. It's a really very, very fun experience. What to do? Here's the irony. every human being, the instant he or she pops out of the womb, is a natural scientist and explorer. That process of sensing, touching, engaging, making sense, trying again, that is the DNA of human development. We somehow managed to beat that kind of curiosity and comfort of exploring out of kids by the time they get to school. And in the first years of schooling. And then they get to around grade 7, we decide we want to reinstall it in them as an interest in STEM. So part of what I think we need to do, and part of what we, as any adult with access to young kids, aunt, uncle, parent, be a co-explorer with them. Let them see you learning. Act like a near peer to them. Yes, you know thousands of dimensions more than they do about something, but to show them the fun and delight of asking, questioning, thinking, building an answer, trying something out, to see that you enjoy it, to feel they're part of your world. That is super, super powerful. Parents of young girls, especially fathers of young girls, be sure you show them all the time that you adore them every bit as much for their adventurousness and their curiosity and their intelligence as you do for their princess outfit or their drawings, or, you know, that matters a lot.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Major Blake. Mara, over to you.
All right, and back on the ocean side, we have Lieutenant Commander Kellen Jones again. Lieutenant Commander Jones, what is your question?
Thanks, Professor. Actually, I'm going to ask a live question from the audience. This comes from Amy Hansen, who is a METOC officer in the Royal Australian Navy. She happens to be a great friend of mine. She was a NPS student not so long ago and got a degree in oceanography. So her question is, what more do you think we can learn from ocean exploration? Specifically, do you think that more ocean exploration will provide humanity with answers to climate change?
It's conceivable it will give us some answers to climate change. I think the biggest gap in our ocean knowledge basically centers on the life that's in the sea. We know precious little about the full scope and variety of life in the ocean. And that's just huge. I mean, the Center of Marine Life, the Census of Marine Life, which ran for a decade some years ago, you were getting 5,000 species a day in single water tows. So your technology is moving in a direction with the speed that can open up really exciting new dimensions for doing this. Autonomous vehicles, semi-autonomous vehicles, eDNA, the ability to get information about what life is in the area around you without actually having to see it, which is kind of currently how we do it. I think that's really very exciting. I said earlier, the human presence means a lot to me, and it does. But when you know what data you need, you're sure of some of the data that you need, and you want to sustain the monitoring in an extended fashion, then there's absolutely fabulous roles for autonomous vehicles. And they're now getting smaller and cheaper to where you can, they could be the ocean equivalent of small sats, where you can put armadas of them out and really get a comprehensive three-dimensional view.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lieutenant Commander Jones. Back to you, Giovanni.
Thank you, Mara. Next, we have Lieutenant Logan West.
Thank you, Dr. Manelli. Hello again, ma'am.
Hello.
My next question for you, it returns back to, we've talked a little bit about your training, but I kind of wanted to expound upon that if possible. So your missions during the Space Shuttle program and your expedition to the Challenger Deep both required significant training and preparation for environments that you're not really easily able to simulate. So during these missions, did you encounter any obstacles that your training did not adequately prepare you for? And if so, what recommendations would you make to future programs to ensure their success?
Yeah, good question. Actually, oddly, the label for my position on the space shuttle was the same one that Victor Vescovo chose for the individuals he invited along. It was mission specialist. But the responsibilities were wildly different. I mean, I was ship's company and sort of chief scientist on the shuttle, so really had to thoroughly know the shuttle and its systems and how they work, and equally thoroughly understand the hardware involved with whatever experiments or satellites that we were deploying and operating. So very intense training for that, and obviously very intense training for a spacewalk. You're basically getting into your very own personal body-shaped spaceship. You're piloted command of your own spaceship when you're out on a spacewalk. In contrast, for the submersible dive, I kind of needed to know where the spare air, the quick on spare air was, and the extended breathing helmet, and obviously how to drop the surfacing weights if Victor keeled over completely, and work the comm system. So that took almost no training at all. The skill required was be pleasant company and observe interesting things out the viewport. So were there any misses? I would say in all of my space flights, there were only one or two minor misses that had to do with little, happily, small deviations of how things behaved in zero gravity that were not apparent in any simulation. The lesson you learn from that is every simulation is lying to you in some way or another. And it's on you to be thinking through the actual physics and engineering as best you know them, to spot those lies and mentally prepare yourself to not be surprised by them when you get to the real world.
Excellent, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lieutenant West. Mara, back over to you.
All right, and next up on our student list, we have Lieutenant Commander Austin West. And Austin, what is your question?
Thank you, Mara. Good afternoon again, ma'am. This question is inspired by the most recent Monterey Whale Fest, where I heard an oceanographer admiral turned lobbyist giving a talk on engaging scientists in politics. And my question to you, obviously you know that many of the well-funded science-related leadership positions and policymaker roles are political appointees or come by political influence. With that in mind, and knowing that all of us will eventually hang up the uniform, what would be your advice to those of us in the STEM fields as far as seeking involvement in public office?
I would absolutely encourage you to do that. The public service dimension of the work that NASA does, NOAA does, those are the key agencies, really, U.S. Geological Survey to a degree. It is tremendously rewarding. And it needs some of the best talents that we can provide. Yes, all of my positions at NOAA were political presidential appointees, but it was long the case, and I hope we're not leaving this entirely behind in our public life, that your scientific credential counted most of all. I was never asked to make a personal loyalty statement to any of the presidents I served. I was asked if I was confident that I could. I was never asked who I voted for. I was expected to assure the people interviewing me that I could serve well in good conscience under a duly elected president, and I could. The agendas, the kind of work that mostly I was doing, happily never really got into terribly politicized domains. I mean, there's not a Republican and Democratic way to forecast the weather or to do the math. It just is, or to protect public safety. I think if you move into an arena where there are some regulatory dimensions, so the scientific input informs a decision that does affect how individuals lead their lives, and in the NOAA world, that would center principally on fisheries. That you will find the politics more intense there, and you will probably find the policy views of the administration that might appoint you being a stronger factor in their establishing confidence that you could lead in the direction they want. If they're very pro-business and open up the rules, let everybody just take as many fish as they want, and you are concerned about conservation values, you might find that tension difficult to navigate, or some administration might decide that you're not the person they would want in that post. But in the physical sciences, physics, engineering, space flight, physical oceanography, weather forecasting, to this day still, thank heavens, has not become a highly politicized role.
Thank you again, ma'am.
And thank you, Lieutenant Commander West. And now as we begin to wrap up, the moderators actually get to ask 2 questions. And so I think I will begin by asking and leading you towards maybe a final closing point and ask you, what was the most awe-inspiring moment in all of your adventures that you faced, something that really resonated our sense of humanity on our planet and whatnot?
I could pick from a long list, but the one that comes immediately to mind is from, I think it was my 3rd shuttle flight. I had a part of my day where I had a quiet moment to just look out the window. And of course, we're going around the Earth every 90 minutes. So for 45 minutes, you're over the daylit side of the Earth, and then you cross the terminator, you're over the dark side of the Earth. And that's about when I was looking out the window. We crossed from the day side over to the night side. I could just about see like a scribed line on the surface of the Earth below me from lit to dark. But we're, of course, hundreds of miles up. So our spacecraft is still in sunlight. And I took in the dark below me and the city lights coming into view, and then noticed how brightly lit we still were. And the thought that flashed in my mind was, there might be a little girl down there right now pointing up and saying to her mom, look, Mommy, there's a satellite, and she's pointing at me. And I think of that now anytime I go outside and watch a space station come over. I know those folks. They're my guys.
That's such a wonderful moment. My kids and I like to watch the space station too, so I'll tell them that. All right, and back to you, Theo, for the last question.
Thank you, Mara. And Dr. Sullivan, if I may, this is a similar question. It has to do with exploration and why we go, why explore. There aren't many people who would actively go to the bottom of the ocean or up to space. And yet there is a reward to doing it. There's a technological development, there's scientific discovery, there's a personal reward. And could you maybe share a couple of thoughts about your own experiences with scientific discovery and the joy perhaps you felt with being involved in some of those discoveries?
Well, I'm driven just by a boundless curiosity. I wonder what that's like. I wonder what's there. I wonder if I can do it. I wonder if I could master that. That's the little interior spring that has always kept me moving. But I'll tell you, my very favorite moment, really vividly memorable moment around exploring was when I was in the middle, coming towards the end of my PhD work. And I had a mass of data. I still couldn't quite make any particular sense of it. And I was spending hours and hours and hours and hours and hours in the science library, going through paper after paper after paper. And there I am in the science library around midnight one night, and the light bulb finally went on. And I realized the thing you're looking for is not in any of these journal pages. No one has ever had the data that you've got. No one's ever made the maps that I have made of the seafloor at this point. And it felt like, if any of you cross-country ski, it felt like I had followed a ski trail to the edge of the forest and come across an open field ahead of me with no ski tracks in it. It was my turn to lay down tracks, to break new ground, and add to that knowledge base that others might build on later. And that is an incredibly special feeling.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for sharing that with us, Dr. Sullivan, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. So with that, our Q&A session is wrapped up. President Rondeau, over to you.
Well, thank you. It's been fascinating, Dr. Sullivan, to go from under the ocean to under the stars and traveling the universe with you this last hour and a half and having our students engage with you. It's been fantastic. Do you have any final comments you would like to make as we wrap up this fabulous session with you?
I would just leave you with the thought that we all of us every day in some way or another have the opportunity to break new ground, to add new knowledge, to add new insight to our own work, to our colleagues, to youngsters in our lives. So hold to that, keep looking for that new insight, that new bit that can power you further and let you share with others around you. Break new ground.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, to be able to reach for that star and hang on and enjoy that ride. In September, for all who are listening, we will have Secretary of the Navy Braithwaite by video talking to our graduates and our graduating staff. Dr. Sullivan, thank you so much for all that you have been and for all that you are. And we ask and we invite you to join us personally when you're able to travel, and know that you have a place to stay here. And it would be great to see you. In October, we're going to have a session on artificial intelligence and national security, if you ever want to listen in to that also. But again, thank you. This has been terrific, and we look forward to having you over here and having you as a guest amongst all of us and seeing these brave students. For everybody, this is the end of our great SGL, and I wish everybody a good week out here.